The lawyer began reading. Standard opening language. Administrative clauses. Gerald was sitting 2 chairs from me, patient in the way of someone waiting for a formality to conclude. Then the 3rd paragraph. I watched his face change in real time. Confusion first, then something harder. The lawyer continued without pausing, calm and precise. The way lawyers read things that are going to change a room. I sat very still, not because I had known what was coming. I hadn't, because I was trying to understand what my mother had done. Quietly, years before any of this, without telling anyone. She had watched everything Gerald did for 15 years. Every subtle exclusion. Every moment he made me feel like a guest in my own home. She had seen all of it, and she had remembered every single thing. Gerald came into my life when I was 7 years old. My mother had been on her own for 2 years before she met him. 2 years that I remember as being quietly content despite everything. Just the 2 of us in a small flat. Her working, me at school. The particular simplicity of a household where the dynamic is uncomplicated, where you know exactly where you stand with the only other person in the room. She was happy when she met Gerald. That was visible and genuine, and I understood it even at 7. She had been carrying a lot alone, and here was someone who wanted to share it. I wanted her to be happy. I didn't resist Gerald the way some children resist a new figure in that role. I tried, genuinely tried, with the open, uncomplicated effort of a child who doesn't yet understand that trying is sometimes not the variable that matters. Gerald was not cruel. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters in this story. He never raised his voice at me, never spoke to me with open hostility, never did anything that a witness in a room could have pointed to and named clearly as wrong. He was polite, consistently and carefully polite. The kind of polite that maintains plausible deniability while communicating something unmistakable underneath. The message underneath was always the same. You're not really part of this. It arrived in small ways. The way decisions about the house were made in conversations I wasn't included in. The way plans for family holidays were discussed at the dinner table as if I was a guest who might or might not be joining rather than a child who lived there. The way Gerald's 2 biological children from his previous relationship were spoken about differently. Not better necessarily on the surface, just differently, with a specific warmth and ownership that was never quite extended in my direction. His children were his. I was my mother's. And in the geography of that household, those were 2 different categories. I noticed all of it. Children notice everything. They may not have the language for it yet. They may not be able to articulate what they are observing, but they notice, and they carry it in the wordless accumulation that shapes how they understand their own position in the world. I understood mine clearly by the time I was 10. I was tolerated, adequately provided for, politely managed, but not wanted in the specific, unconditional way that children need to be wanted. Not by Gerald. My mother's position was its own kind of complicated. She loved me. I never doubted that. Her love was real and consistent and present in every way that mattered when Gerald wasn't the variable. But she was conflict avoidant in a way that I came to understand as one of her deepest characteristics. She could not hold 2 difficult things at once. She could not love Gerald and challenge him simultaneously. She could not maintain the relationship she had built with him and also stand visibly and loudly in my corner against him. So she did neither. She occupied the space between, warm with me privately, quiet when Gerald's behavior in my direction would have warranted a response, hoping, I think, that it would resolve itself, that Gerald would warm over time, that the household would find its own balance without her having to force it. It never did. I stopped waiting for it to by the time I was 12. Not bitterly, just practically. The way children adapt when the environment makes clear that certain things are not going to change. You find the parts of your life that belong to you. Build your world within them. Learn to need less from the parts that are consistently unavailable. School became more important. Friends became more important. The world outside the house became more important. I put my energy there, worked hard, stayed out of Gerald's way without it being a performance. Just found the path through adolescence that required the least friction with a man who had decided before I was old enough to do anything about it that I was not his, and that not being his meant not quite belonging anywhere he considered as either. I left home at 18, not dramatically, just as soon as I reasonably could, and the relief of that was something I felt for weeks afterward. Leaving home at 18 felt like taking a full breath for the first time. Not because my life had been unbearable. It hadn't. But there is a specific kind of tension that comes from living in a space where you are consistently reminded of your own marginal status. A low-grade pressure that you stop noticing consciously after a while because it becomes the permanent texture of the environment. You only notice it when it lifts. And when I closed the door of my first rented room behind me, and sat in the quiet of space that was entirely mine, it lifted completely. I built my life the way people build lives when they have learned early that external support is not reliably available. Self-sufficiently, without expecting things to be handed to me, without assuming that anyone else's resources or goodwill were part of my plan. Just my own effort applied consistently to the things that mattered. I worked through university. Not comfortably, but manageably. Finished with a degree and a debt, and the particular confidence of someone who has done something difficult entirely under their own power. Found work in my field. Built my professional life with the same methodical patience I had developed as a child, finding the parts of life that belonged to me and investing in those. By my late 20s, I had a small flat I was paying off. A career with genuine momentum. A small group of friends who knew me properly. A life that was mine in every sense. I maintained a relationship with my mother throughout all of this. That was never in question. Whatever had happened in that house, whatever Gerald's presence had cost me in terms of belonging, she was still my mother. Still the person who had loved me genuinely even when she hadn't protected me effectively. Those are two different things, and I had learned to hold them separately. I visited on occasions when Gerald's presence was manageable. Christmas sometimes. Birthdays occasionally. The kind of visits that were long enough to be real and short enough to avoid the particular accumulation of small moments that Gerald's presence tended to produce. Gerald was the same. Politely exclusionary with the consistency of someone who had been doing it for so long it required no effort. He had grandchildren by then from his biological children. The house had the particular quality of a family home built around people who belonged to it. I was always the person passing through, arriving with gifts and leaving with the quiet relief of someone returning to a space where the air was their own. My mother and I talked differently when Gerald wasn't there. On the phone, which became our primary way of staying close as the years went on, she was warmer than in person, more present, more interested in the actual texture of my life rather than the surface version of it. She asked about work in a way that meant she had remembered what I told her the previous time. Asked about friends by name. Asked about whether I was happy in the specific way mothers ask when they actually want to know the answer. I appreciated those conversations without reading too much into the difference between them and the in-person visits. I told myself it was simply the dynamic. That Gerald's presence in the room changed things for her in ways that the phone removed. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. I didn't know that yet. Gerald's children had grown into adults who had absorbed their father's categorization of me without apparently examining it. We were not hostile to each other. We were polite in the way that people are polite when they have been taught by example that someone exists in a different category. They were family. I was adjacent to family. At gatherings, we exchanged the appropriate pleasantries, sat at the same table, passed the same dishes, and maintained a comfortable distance that nobody acknowledged because nobody needed to. It was simply how things were. I had made peace with that, not a performed peace, an actual one. I had built enough of a life outside that dynamic that it no longer had the power to define me. Gerald's opinion of my place in the family had mattered enormously when I was 7. By the time I was 30, it was simply an old fact about the landscape of my childhood. Present but not powerful. Noted but not carried. I had moved on from needing anything from Gerald a long time ago. What I hadn't fully processed was that my mother had never moved on from watching what he had done, had never stopped seeing it, had never stopped carrying it. In her own quiet way, in her own time, she was building something I knew nothing about, waiting until she was ready, waiting until she was certain, waiting until the document was in the right hands and the outcome was beyond anyone's ability to quietly undo. I didn't know any of that then. I just knew she called more as she got older, and I was always glad when she did. The calls started becoming more frequent about 3 years before she died. Not dramatically more frequent. Not in a way that immediately signaled something significant was changing. Just a gradual increase in the rhythm of contact. Where there had been one call a week, there were now 2. Where calls had lasted 20 minutes, they started lasting 40. The quality of them changed alongside the frequency. She asked more questions, listened more carefully to the answers, followed threads from previous conversations with a specificity that told me she was thinking about what I had said between the calls. Not just maintaining contact, actually paying attention. I noticed it, filed it as a good thing without examining it too carefully. My mother and I had always had a real relationship beneath the complications of the household. I told myself she was simply getting older, that the particular focus on family that comes with age was expressing itself in more frequent contact. That it was natural and I should simply be glad of it. I was glad of it. She asked about my work differently during this period. Not the surface version of asking. The version that means you want to understand what someone actually does and why it matters to them. She asked questions that required real answers, and she received those answers with the kind of attention that made giving them feel worthwhile. We talked about things we hadn't talked about much before. My life as a child, what I had enjoyed, what had been difficult. She navigated that territory carefully, never pushing into anything that required her to directly address Gerald's role in it, but circling it in a way that told me she knew the territory was there. Once, during one of those conversations, she said something brief that I have thought about many times since. She said she knew she hadn't always handled things as well as she should have. That was all. She didn't expand on it, didn't name anything specifically, just said it quietly and moved the conversation forward before I could respond with more than an acknowledgement. I told her it was all right, because in the way that matters most it was. I had built my life. I was okay. The past was what it was. She seemed to receive that with something that looked like relief, but also something else. Something that I read at the time as the particular emotion of a parent who has carried a specific weight for a long time and is not quite ready to put it down yet. I understand now what that weight was, but I didn't understand it then. Her health began to decline about 18 months before she died. Gradually at first, the kind of decline that presents as the ordinary accumulation of age before it becomes something more specific. She mentioned tiredness more, mentioned appointments at the doctor in passing without offering details. I asked once directly if everything was all right. She said she was fine, said it with enough conviction that I chose to believe it. Because sometimes you choose to believe things because the alternative is a conversation you're not ready to have. I visited more during this period. Not just for the significant occasions, for ordinary weekends, arriving on a Saturday and leaving on a Sunday. The visits were different from the ones in earlier years. Gerald was there, but something in the dynamic had shifted. Not dramatically. He was still the same man, still occupying the house with the particular ownership of someone who considers it entirely his. But my mother's attention during those visits was more directly on me. More willing to pull the focus toward us in a way she had historically allowed Gerald to redirect. Small things, but I noticed them. The diagnosis came about 8 months before the end. She told me on the phone, calmly, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for things that frightened her. I drove to the house the following day. We sat in the kitchen while Gerald was elsewhere in the house. and she talked about it with more openness than she had talked about anything difficult in all the years I could remember. What the treatment would involve, what the realistic outlook was, what she wanted the time ahead to look like. She said she had things in order. Used that phrase specifically. Things in order. I understood it as the practical language of someone who had thought carefully about the end. Wills. Arrangements. The administrative preparation that responsible people make. I had no reason to hear anything more specific in it than that. I just held her hand across the kitchen table and told her I wasn't going anywhere. She looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I have spent a great deal of time thinking about since. Something between love and sorrow and something else. Something that looked almost like quiet determination. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. She had already been to the lawyer. She had already made her decision. She had already put in place the thing she had been thinking about for years. Quietly, completely, without saying a word to anyone. The months that followed were difficult in the way those months always are. I was there as much as I could be, present in that house more than I had been since I left it at 18. Gerald moved around me with the same careful distance he had always maintained. Even then, even those months, the habits of 15 years don't dissolve in the presence of illness. They just become more visible against the weight of everything else. She died on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was there. Gerald was there. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something that cannot be undone has just happened. And whatever Gerald thought about my presence in that room, he kept it behind the same polite distance he had always kept everything. For now, the funeral was handled by Gerald. That was expected. He was her husband. The practical decisions belonged to him by default and by law. I didn't challenge any of it. Not the venue, not the order of service, not the arrangements for afterward. I offered to help where I could. He received those offers with the particular politeness that means no thank you without saying it. So I stepped back, attended as a son, just a son, without a role in the organization of the day, which is its own kind of loss when the person being buried is your mother. The service was appropriate, well attended. My mother had been well-liked in ways that existed entirely independently of Gerald. Friends from different chapters of her life, colleagues from years of work, neighbors who had known her since long before any of us. People who loved her for reasons that had nothing to do with the family dynamic that had defined so much of my experience of her. Seeing all of those people in one room was something. Understanding through their presence the full scale of who she had been beyond the particular corners of her life I had occupied. Gerald stood at the front of the room with his children, the three of them receiving condolences together. A unit. I stood slightly to the side, not from any deliberate choice, just from a natural geometry of a room where the lines of belonging had been drawn a long time ago. People who knew me found me, offered their condolences genuinely, said the things people say when they mean them. I received all of it with the particular numbness of someone who has not yet fully processed what has happened, who is moving through the required moments of a difficult day on a kind of automatic function. Gerald spoke to me twice during the day, both times briefly, both times with the same surface correctness he had maintained for 15 years. At one point in the afternoon, I watched him accept condolences from a group of people who clearly knew him well. Watched him inhabit the role of bereaved husband with a completeness that left no visible room for the complexity of what the last 15 years had actually contained. I watched it without anger, just noted it, stored alongside everything else being stored that day. The will reading was scheduled for the following week, a formality as far as Gerald was concerned. I could see that in how he referenced it. The particular confidence of someone who considers an outcome settled before it has been formally confirmed. He had mentioned to one of his children within my earshot that the solicitor had indicated it would be straightforward. The word straightforward carrying all the weight of an assumption. That assumption was written across everything he did that week. The way he discussed the house. The practical decisions he was already making about what would happen to my mother's belongings. The particular ownership that had always characterized his relationship with the physical space of that home settling into something even more complete now that she was gone. I said nothing, made no comment, asked no questions that would have revealed what I was thinking, because I genuinely didn't know what I was thinking. I had no specific expectation of the will. My mother had never discussed it with me, had never said anything beyond that phrase about having things in order. I arrived at the solicitor's office on the appointed morning. Gerald and his 2 children were already there when I came in. They were arranged in their chairs with the ease of people who had agreed before arriving on how this was going to feel. I took my seat. The solicitor was a precise woman in her 60s. She opened the document without preamble, began reading. The opening clauses were standard, administrative language establishing the document's validity. Gerald was patient, composed. His children were quiet. Then the 3rd paragraph. I watched Gerald's face with the involuntary attention of someone who senses before they understand. The patience dissolved. His expression moved through confusion and arrived somewhere harder. His children exchanged a brief look. The solicitor continued reading without changing her pace or her tone. My mother's voice in careful legal language. Specific, deliberate, unambiguous. The family home, a significant portion of the estate, left directly to me. The solicitor finished the relevant section. The room was very quiet. Gerald looked at me. For the first time in 15 years, he looked at me with complete attention. Not the managed politeness, not the careful distance. Just looked. I held his gaze, said nothing, because my mother had already said everything that needed to be said. Years ago, in a solicitor's office very much like this one, without anyone present, without telling anyone, just quietly, precisely, and with complete love, making sure I was protected, Gerald contested the will within the week. I was not surprised. The particular confidence with which he had entered that solicitor's office had to go somewhere when it collided with a reality it hadn't anticipated. And contesting was the only move available to someone who had just watched an assumption he had held for years dissolve in the space of paragraph. His grounds were the standard ones available in these situations. Undue influence. The suggestion that my mother had not been acting of her own free will when the will was prepared. That someone had pressured or manipulated her into making decisions she would not have made independently. The implication being that the someone was me. I want to sit with that for a moment, because the specific irony of Gerald contesting on those grounds was not lost on me. A man who had spent 15 years quietly and systematically making me feel like a guest in my own home, who had made every significant decision about that house without my inclusion, who had managed to be consistently and plausibly exclusionary for a decade and a half without ever doing anything over enough to be named directly. That man was now alleging that I had exercised undue influence over my mother. I noted the particular quality of that argument without spending much energy on it, because the argument was not going to survive contact with the facts. The solicitor who had prepared the will was clear. She had met with my mother on multiple occasions over the course of the process. Alone, without me present, without Gerald present, without anyone present. Those meetings had been structured specifically to establish that my mother was acting of her own volition, that she understood fully what she was preparing, that she was of sound mind and was making decisions that reflected her genuine wishes. The solicitor had documented all of this carefully, because she was good at her job, and good solicitors who prepare wills for clients who are making significant or potentially contested decisions know how to protect those decisions against exactly the kind of challenge that Gerald had just filed. My mother had not arrived at that solicitor's office confused or pressured. She had arrived prepared, with clear intentions, with specific instructions, with the particular focused clarity of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally decided the time is right to act on it. The solicitor's documentation reflected that clarity precisely. Gerald's legal team requested the full history of the will preparation. They received it. I was told by my own solicitor that the review of that documentation had been relatively brief before the picture became clear. The will had been prepared over several months. Multiple independent consultations. A client who was consistent, specific, and demonstrably acting without external pressure. Nothing in the documentation supported the undue influence claim. Nothing in the timeline supported it either. It will have been updated years before my mother's illness. Years before the period when influence over a vulnerable person might have been more plausible. She had done it from a position of full health and complete independence, which meant the foundation of Gerald's challenge had nothing to stand on. His legal team filed a formal challenge with the court. The court reviewed the evidence. The process took several months. My solicitor was steady throughout, not dismissive of the process, but clear about where the evidence pointed. He had reviewed the will preparation documentation and assessed the challenge with the same directness Mr. Garrett had brought to the business case in the earlier story. He said the challenge was unlikely to succeed, that the documentation was thorough enough to withstand the scrutiny, that my mother had done this properly. I want to describe the months of that process honestly, because they were not comfortable. Being accused of manipulating your mother, having that allegation exist in a formal legal document, sitting with the knowledge that the narrative Gerald was advancing was the specific inversion of everything that had actually happened in that house for 15 years. That was difficult in a way that went beyond the practical inconvenience of legal proceedings. It was a particular kind of difficult, the kind that comes from being accused of something that contradicts everything you know to be true about yourself, by someone whose actual behavior toward you over 15 years was as far from what he was alleging as it is possible to be. I held that without speaking publicly about it, without responding to Gerald directly, without engaging with his children who had taken their father's position and maintained their distance from me during the process. Just let the legal machinery do what legal machinery does when the evidence is as clear as it was. My mother had protected the decision, long before she was ill, long before any of this was a live situation. She had sat in a solicitor's office and made sure that what she intended was documented in a way that would withstand exactly the challenge it was now facing. She had been thinking ahead, with the particular foresight of someone who knew the people involved well enough to anticipate how they would respond. The court found in my favor. Gerald's challenge was dismissed. The will stood exactly as my mother had written it. Everything she had intended for me was confirmed, and Gerald's assumption of the settled outcome he had carried into that solicitor's office was formally and finally over. The confirmation came through on a Thursday morning. My solicitor called, said the challenge had been dismissed, said the estate would be distributed as my mother had intended. I thanked him, put the phone down, and sat for a long time in the quiet of my flat, not with triumph, not with the particular satisfaction of a score being settled, with something much more complicated than that, because the longer I sat with it, the more clearly I understood that what I was feeling was not about Gerald. It had never really been about Gerald. It was about my mother, about what she had done, about the specific quality of love that expresses itself, not in words, but in actions taken quietly and alone, in a solicitor's office, years before they were needed, without telling anyone, without seeking acknowledgement, without ever saying to me directly what she had seen or how she felt about it or what she intended to do about it. She had watched everything Gerald did for 15 years, every subtle exclusion, every decision made without me, every gathering where the geometry of the room reflected a hierarchy she had not created but had not effectively challenged. She had watched all of it, and she had said nothing out loud, because saying it out loud would have required a confrontation she didn't have in her, a reckoning with Gerald that would have fractured the life she had built and the relationship she had chosen. She couldn't do that. That was her limitation, and I had understood it for most of my adult life. But what I hadn't understood, what she had never told me, was that her silence was not the same as her acceptance. She had not made peace with what Gerald did. She had simply stored it. carried it, watched it accumulate over years with the quiet attention of someone building a case. Not for a court, for a document, for the one moment when Gerald would have no voice in the outcome, when she could speak entirely for herself, without his presence in the room, without the decades of dynamic between them shaping what was possible to say. She had waited for that moment, and she had used it with complete precision. That understanding arrived in me slowly during the days after the confirmation. Not all at once, in pieces, each piece landing differently. She had seen me, properly, the whole time, even when her actions in the moment hadn't reflected it. Even when she had chosen the path of least resistance in the room rather than standing visibly in my corner. She had seen every single thing, and she had decided that the way she could protect me most completely was not through confrontation that might have been unpicked or reversed or eroded over time, but through a document, prepared properly, witnessed correctly, sitting with a solicitor in a filing cabinet, waiting, ready to do exactly what it did. I thought about the last years of her life, the increased calls, the longer conversations, the more genuine attention. I had read that as a natural shift, the particular focus that comes with age. Now I understood it differently. She had updated the will years before, had been carrying the knowledge of it through every subsequent conversation, every visit, every quiet kitchen table moment where she said she wished she had handled things better. She was not just checking in on me. She was spending time with the son she had protected, knowing what she had done, knowing it was in place, knowing that whatever happened next, he would be all right. I sold the house. Not quickly, not angrily. After an appropriate amount of time, and with the practical straightforwardness of someone making a clear-eyed decision. Gerald had moved out by then. The estate had been distributed as the will directed. He received what was specifically his and nothing more. His children received their portion and nothing more. The house was mine to do with as I chose. And I chose to sell it. Not out of spite. I want to be clear about that. Not to remove something from Gerald. Not to make a point to anyone. I sold it because it had never been home. Not really. It was the house where I had grown up understanding that I didn't fully belong. Where every room carried the particular memory of being managed and maintained and politely excluded. My mother's presence in it was real and precious. But her presence was in me now. Not on the walls of a building where I had spent 15 years learning to need less than I deserved. I took what she had left me, and I moved forward, not into anything dramatic, just into the next chapter of a life I had been building entirely on my own terms for years, with more foundation under it now than I had expected. Not just financial, the other kind, the kind that comes from understanding that someone who mattered to you saw you clearly, knew your worth, and made sure that knowledge was somewhere permanent, somewhere Gerald's polite distance and careful exclusions could never reach. I don't have a relationship with Gerald now. There was nothing to maintain and no reason to attempt it. His children and I exist in the same distant category we always occupied. Polite if we ever encounter each other, which is rarely. I don't carry anger toward any of them. The anger that existed earlier in the process has settled into something quieter, something that doesn't require ongoing energy, just the clear-eyed recognition of what happened and the equally clear-eyed recognition that it is finished. What I carry instead is something I didn't expect to be carrying, something that arrived with the understanding of what my mother had done, a retrospective knowledge that changes how I read 15 years of history. Every phone call now carries a different weight in memory. Every conversation where she said she knew she hadn't handled things well. Every visit where she pulled the focus toward us in those small ways I had noticed without fully understanding. She was always telling me something, in the language available to her. The language of presence and attention and quiet accumulated care. The will was just the clearest sentence in a conversation she had been having with me for years, saying the things she could never quite say out loud. I see you. I always saw you. And I made sure that counted for something. Some people can't protect you the way you needed them to in the moment, But that doesn't always mean they weren't trying to protect you in the only way they knew how. If this story stayed with you, the quiet love in it, the way some people show you they were watching all along, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.